Hello, everybody. Welcome to this E3G press briefing. My name's Claire Healy, and I run the Washington office of E3G. I can see a couple more people joining. We have an hour or up to an hour. Thank you for joining. And we've tried to invite some colleagues who were on the ground in Glasgow to give you sort of a taster of their analysis and assessment. What we're not going to do this morning is do another description of what happened on the ground and the outcomes. I think by today, Wednesday, we've had enough of that. We've had a lot of that. What we're going to try and share with you is our assessment and our analysis of the big picture, sort of the package, the political signals that were sent, as well as priority actions heretofore. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Alex Scott, who will go first. Alex runs our program on climate diplomacy and geopolitics, and sort of led the team on the ground in Glasgow, which was quite significant and substantial, covering all the different initiatives and sector-specific announcements. Alden Meyer, who many of you may know, Alden has been to, I think, every COP bar one. And we're so privileged to have Alden working with us as E3G. And we're looking forward to hearing what he says about this particular COP and the mood and the tone and what it delivered. And also my colleague, Taylor Dimsdale, who runs our program on risk and resilience. And as you know, adaptation and loss and damage was a particular breakthrough issue at this COP. So we're looking forward to what he has to say. What we intend to do is just have very short, sharp remarks at the top end. Well, we'll just give you a taster of our thoughts, and we can go in multiple different directions. And so we really want to hear what you want us to give you some analysis on. So we'll spend most time just responding to your questions. And if we don't have the right expertise here, we can put you in touch with one of our colleagues who's no doubt has been covering that particular issue if we can't cover it today. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to ask Alex to just give her top line analysis of the overall package, and particularly the role of the presidency and her personal perspectives on what got done on the ground in Glasgow. Alex.
Sure, Claire. I mean, my top line assessment is that we really got a much stronger acceleration package out of this COP than I was certainly expecting going into it. I think the humility from the way the UK presidency assessed it at the end and some of the concerns raised by civil society and vulnerable countries are right. The package as a whole doesn't put us on that pathway to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It's not right, though, to look at it in a success or failure term in terms of whether it puts us on that pathway. What it does do is gives us enough progress in the hooks in politics and process that it sets up into next year and beyond to show that the Paris Agreement is still working. That was the key question that needed to be answered at this COP as the first test of that Paris Agreement ratcheting mechanism. And it needed to have a response to the IPCC's new Code Red science. And what we got from the package as a whole does do that. On the train going up to Glasgow, I really wasn't sure we were going to get anything that looked like a commitment to come back on 2030 targets next year. And we did get that in the package. We were in this context of intense geopolitical tension between the US and China, an EU who is normally the climate powerhouse looking very inward because of the COVID economic crisis and its work on its own domestic policy, and most other countries having their fiscal space so completely squeezed by COVID that the idea of ramping up climate ambition had been squeezed largely off the agenda. And what we got out of this COP is a package of acceleration mechanisms that could see countries mobilizing the money that would be needed to help particularly the middle income major emitting countries to bring new NDCs forward again next year. And we saw some political appetite from that in the way that the leaders came into the COP at the start, the press briefings from the US and the EU and the UK on their global infrastructure investment platforms and so on. So I think what we got was a major step forward. My other top line assessment is that you can really tell the difference that the UNFCCC space makes, the global space where the vulnerable countries get to come in and bring their moral voice and weight to the argument. And you can see that in the difference between the text on coal and 1.5 degrees and ambition in the 2020s between what we got at the G20 the Sunday before with just those G20 countries, and then what we landed in that Glasgow Climate Pact by the end of COP. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, I know you've been Alex has been working on this package and for the past 2 years doing all the different scenarios, setting the benchmarks by which we can assess whether it delivered or not. And obviously halfway through we had to do a big pivot because of COVID. So it's good to hear that it delivered on all that hard work, at least from your perspective. Okay, without further ado, Alden, please tell us how, in all your vast experience as a veteran of all these different events, what did you come away from Glasgow thinking and feeling, and what do you think the priorities are now, in particular for the US going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think COP26 really reflected the pivot from years and years of negotiations over framework agreements, protocols, rules, et cetera, to implementation. I mean, you might say this was the Nike COP, just do it. We've got the framework convention, we've got the Paris Agreement, countries have made their initial pledges under that. We knew coming in that we're nowhere near adequate to the task of keeping temperature increases below 1.5 C, which is now the new North Star. No one was talking about well under 2 degrees anymore. Everyone was focused on 1.5. And we know there's a huge gap to make up there. So we didn't get everything we needed on that, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but we got a number of hooks in the Glasgow Climate Pact to build some political pressure moving forward towards COP27 and COP28. We did close the Paris rulebook. This was a long journey. We finalized Article 6 on emissions trading. We finalized the transparency rules. We finalized the common timeframe. So that chapter is closed. And we're really now full on to implementation. You know, I think it was important to have the leaders come in the first 2 days of the COP and provide some political momentum, and then the whole series of sectoral announcements the first week on forests, on cars, on methane, on phasing out fossil fuel finance, on coal. Those were not consensus decisions, but they were large grouping of countries that sort of gave some wind at our back going into the second week. But we always knew it would be brutal in the second week. The US focus was heavily on mitigation and 1.5 degrees, and you've seen them focusing on this since President Biden took office in January. At the Biden Climate Summit, they focused on getting some of the other developed countries, such as Japan and Canada, on side to try to get up to the level of ambition that the US put on the table in April, minus 50 to 52%. And they were really focusing on over the rest of the year on the big emerging economies, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and others. We did see the announcement on South Africa, which was significant on the transition away from coal. We don't yet have the finance on offer to countries like India and Indonesia to get them to move and make explicit commitments, although I think Prime Minister Modi's commitment to 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity, non-carbon capacity was significant. Obviously, for the US, the big target is China. That's always been the case. They want to build pressure on China. They realize they're not the ones to do that because of our overall toxic relationship, but they're trying to make China move forward. We did have the US-China declaration the Wednesday, the second week, which was certainly significant in terms of the tone and politics of it. In terms of the content, the biggest piece there is China's commitment to develop a methane action plan over the next year or two. And the US told me that China has 1.5 gigatons of methane reduction potential at relatively low cost by 2030. Just to give you a scale, that's equivalent to the total current emissions of Japan. So it's not insignificant. Of course, the big question is, will China bring forward ambition to COP27 or COP28 on its domestic coal consumption? Where the US really fell short, and this is a broken record, is finance. Of course, we blocked other countries in the developed countries from committing to try to make up the shortfall in 2020 and 2021, at least, in the $100 billion pledge. We did commit to doubling collective adaptation finance, and Taylor's going to talk about that in a minute. That's significant. And of course, the big drama, which I don't think the US fully anticipated how it would play out, was on loss and damage, which Taylor will also talk about. The fact is, because we've done so little in the 30 years since Rio, and we are now on track to at least 1.5 and possibly over 2, the impacts on the vulnerable countries and communities is going to continue to increase. And we have both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative of helping them deal with those impacts. So that's part of the unfinished business. In terms of next steps, I would say, in addition to loss and damage, which Taylor will comment on, the 2 big ones are driving the infrastructure financing with the UK, Europe, and others to really deliver on the Build Back Better for the World announcement at the G7 summit, and clean energy decarbonization. The US is holding a ministerial meeting of the Major Economies Forum in January, and it will be hosting the Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation Summits in Washington next June. So it has the potential to help drive sectoral decarbonization in league with other countries around the world in the run-up to COP27 in Egypt. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so much ground to cover. And so there are many different ways we could go much deeper, depending on, again, where you'd like us to go. Talking about covering ground, I think Alden came back with a sore toe from literally walking around Glasgow, covering the ground quite literally. Taylor, what were your takeaways in terms of the portfolio that you cover and have been covering for many years? And finally, it feels like it's got some political traction around it. And I think right to the end, I think, was one of the big issues. So tell us what your takeaways were and what it means now, particularly for the US.
Sure, thanks, Claire. And I think Alden has touched on some of this already and has created a good segue into the conversation about adaptation and loss and damage. So I think that was one of the big question marks going into Glasgow, was how much support would be offered to particularly the most climate vulnerable countries in addressing climate impacts. And I think you'd have to start with the recognition of the very real and deep disappointment, clearly, particularly from the small island states, the least developed countries, that in the agreement there wasn't any actual new money on the table for loss and damage. I think given the risks that they are facing, they have legitimate reasons, to have been disappointed in the outcome and effectively sort of accepted it while also expressing their disappointment. However, I think looking at the big picture, while it probably wasn't the best possible outcome on those issues, it was also far from the worst. So I think you could point to several things that were delivered. One was just a change in the tone of the discussions and the politics around adaptation and loss and damage. So these issues were much more prominently on the agenda at COP26 than I think they've been in years past. It was one of the 5 strategic priorities for the UK presidency. And speaking of the US, getting the US to even talk about loss and damage in the past has really been like pulling teeth. And I think they came with a new willingness and recognition that they needed to engage with this issue. All of which I think is really the result of improvements in the science, the IPCC report, as well as some of the devastating impacts that we see seemingly every week somewhere in the world. So I do think the politics and the discussion has shifted in that sense. I think you got 2 of the key benchmarks for success were delivered. So one Alden already mentioned was the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025, and the other being the Santiago network is going to be a real thing and well-resourced. And hopefully that will deliver some much needed technical assistance for vulnerable countries. I think neither of those things were guaranteed to be delivered at Glasgow, so I do think those are wins. You also have some language in the text around encouraging financial institutions to consider vulnerability, including vulnerability to climate impacts, in their provision and mobilization of concessional financial resources, which I think is an important piece of the agreement. And then, of course, you have this 2-year dialogue on funding for loss and damage. So I think the most vulnerable countries have effectively given the rest of the world a sort of lifeline and accepted a less than perfect outcome in Glasgow in return for some assurances that there will be some solutions on the table soon. I think what needs to happen moving forward essentially two things. So one is that we just need a new framework really for understanding loss and damage that goes beyond this is just a transactional issue, and have more of a mature conversation about what climate risk really means and what it means or would mean to miss some of these targets, for example, 1.5 degrees, and particularly what it would mean for some of the most vulnerable countries. And then the second is that I think this dialogue on funding for loss and damage needs to deliver some real concrete solutions in the near term. I'll stop there.
Right, okay, that was great, thank you. And all the calls I've been on post-COP, a lot of the sort of analysis has literally taken up most of the hour, so thank you to my colleagues for keeping it short and sweet. But really it's now over to you guys. What questions do you have? Like, where would you like us to go deeper in terms of providing some analysis or assessments? I'm looking at the Q&A function, or maybe I think panelists, can they also speak? I'm not too sure if I can hear you, or it has to be typed in the Q&A function.
Yeah, Claire, maybe while we're waiting for journalists to put in questions, let me just start with one of the big issues that I've been asked about and others on the call have been asked about both before, during, and after Glasgow, which is, did we meet the UK presidency test of keeping 1.5 alive? And I said in Glasgow to journalist dinner we did the midweek that 1.5 is alive, but it's in intensive care. I mean, if you look at the Climate Action Tracker analysis of all the commitments that countries made in the run-up to Glasgow, the new US NDC, the Japan, Canada NDCs, and others, plus the sum total of all the announcements that were made that first week in the sectors, it adds up to somewhere between 20, 22, 23%. So it's good, it's a down payment, it's progress, but it's nowhere near the scale that we need to have a good chance of keeping temperatures below 1.5, which is so critical, as Taylor said, to minimize the loss and damage, the risk, not only to developing countries, but to us. I mean, look at what's been happening in the US, Germany, other developed countries as well. So I think we can pat ourselves on the back for some progress, but job not done yet. It's way too early to hang up the mission accomplished banner. And these next two COPs in Egypt and UAE are going to be critical to see if we really can bend that emissions curve anywhere near the rate that the science tells us we need to have a fighting chance, not just 1.5, but even staying well below 2.
That's right. Brad, I see you've joined us, so I think now you can speak. So Brad, what question do you have? And please let us indicate and we can bring you in as well. Brad?
Yeah, could you hear me okay? Hello?
Yep. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. Brad Pollover with the Times. I was just wondering if you could speak a little more about what's reasonable to expect in terms of updated NDCs next year at Glasgow. Kerry indicated that, you know, he thought the US was already doing enough in terms of its targets. Timmermans kind of said the same about the EU after Glasgow ended. I think the Australian government put out a release saying, well, you know, we think we're good. So, you know, there might be reasonable arguments for some of those, maybe less so Australia, but what's to stop other countries from also sort of saying, no, we think what we're doing is aligned with Paris. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk through what we, you know, if there might be movement we see and where.
Right, okay, Alden, let's go to you first, then Alex. But I mean, more broadly, I think your point, Brad, about already we start managing expectations. I think COP27 seems to start now. So in terms of that expectation management point, Alden, what do you think? And then Alex, please come in.
Well, let me, Brad, put it into 3 categories: the good, the missing, and the ugly. The good, I mean, you've got a number of countries that have moved to roughly a 50% reduction target for themselves in 2030, which is about in the range of where we need to get to globally to have a chance of 1.5. But of course, and that includes the US, you know, Japan, 46 to 50%, Canada, a little lower, EU, 55%. Basically in the target range, but of course on an equity basis, these countries, developed countries, should be doing more to accommodate the extra time it's going to take developing countries to get to that level. So you can't say we've done our fair share yet if you're the US, Europe, or other countries, but we've done a fair amount. You've got some big countries that are missing, including China and India, Indonesia, and others that have not yet really significantly updated their NDCs from Paris. As I said in the opening remarks, the US is focusing with the UK and Europe intensively on some of those countries like Indonesia, India, to try to get them comfortable enough to move by COP27 or COP28 to say they'll start phasing down of coal, but we're not there yet. China is a huge issue, but as I said, I would expect they might move on the low-cost methane thing, but continue to resist putting out a date certain to start phasing down coal. And then you've got the ugly. You mentioned one of them, Australia, which is just ludicrous. Australia has been an outlier in this whole process for 30 years, negotiating a very sweet and weak target under Kyoto, putting forward a very weak 2030 NDC, grudgingly just committing to net zero and yet not doing anything to comply with that. It's time for other countries to really start putting the squeeze on them and to threaten trade consequences or other stuff if they don't get in line. And then you've got a couple countries like Brazil and Mexico, which have actually gone in the wrong direction and submitted weaker NDCs than their original ones from Paris. And they really need to feel some pressure and some consequences too to get with the program. So it's a mixed bag. I think it's anyone's guess, and Alex can comment on this, what we're likely to see by Sharm el-Sheikh a year from now. I think it depends partly what the developed countries like the US put on the table in terms of a financing and technology package for some of these countries, but it's also domestic politics. You saw India block the phase out of coal language on the floor. That wasn't because they were angry with the presidency. It's because there's huge domestic pressures in India not to give too much to the demands from northern countries to move faster on getting off of coal. And those politics are not going to change significantly between now and Egypt, I don't think.
Alex, what's your perspective about the US and what they have to come to the table with in terms of their NDC by Egypt?
Sure. I think countries will definitely be judged in Egypt on whether they live up to this acceleration pathway that they agreed in the Glasgow Climate Pact. I think the diplomatic lift that it will take to enable some of particularly the middle income major emitting countries to answer that call, as Alden said, will be huge and will require significant packages of finance to get there. I think there are multiple ways that countries could come back and look at their 2030 ambition. The exact phrase that was agreed to was requesting parties to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets in their NDCs. And there are multiple ways to do that. One is on the headline targets, and we do need movement on the headline targets from the major emitters to get us closer to that 1.5 degree pathway. But the other way is in giving more detail on the actual policy implementation plans for getting to those headline targets. We saw several countries signing up to sectoral targets and pledges and commitments at the COP. We need to see them putting those sectoral targets and commitments into their NDCs to bring them into the Paris accountability process in that Paris rulebook that was agreed at Glasgow. And from the US, I think we'll need to see some movement on headline target and on actual policy implementation. There's not a lot of political space to move on the headline target. The implementation will be particularly key. And this was what we saw playing out during the COP as the kind of geopolitical battle between China and the US pushed back on headline targets versus implementation policies. And we will need to see the US coming back with that implementation to be part of the groundswell of answering that acceleration package that was agreed in the pact.
Thank you. A couple of points, and I'm looking at the Q&A function now. A couple more questions on this issue of credibility and integrity, right? I think one of the key takeaways is this gap between the soaring rhetoric, right, and the reality on the ground. I think the question on the US, I think everyone needs to sort of feel the US can deliver the targets already tabled. And so all eyes are on Congress and what's coming out of Congress. But we do know that the US, the administration has been modeling other tools and levers at their disposal to deliver on their target. And who knows, what will happen once the packages hopefully are agreed at Congress, when you sort of see and model that and what that can drive in terms of emission cuts, what more or what other tools, could be deployed, right? But I think we have to see that delivery plan first before we start credibly talking about an enhancement of NDC. But again, to Alden's point, the US could do a lot more to help other countries enhance their ambition in terms of, particularly around this B3W, this big infrastructure investment package or initiative. We need to see more money, real money, and the modalities of what that looks like, as well as more energy around these big energy deals, not just South Africa. Again, where's the 8.5 billion going to come from? But also, is that really a template for others? And by Egypt, do we have deals with Indonesia, India, and others? So that's one potential area we need to be looking at. In terms of credibility and integrity, we can also see a question about GFANZ and the 130 trillion commitment. I'm going to call on Alex to say something about that, because I think we have a team looking at finance and working with the private sector on these initiatives, as well as the MDBs, and there's a question on MDBs. But I think that sort of landed with a bit of a thud, the 130 trillion, and really did feed this narrative about sort of the need for credibility and integrity. Alex, did you have any views on the GFANZ? Then I can take the MDB question, and maybe we can ask Taylor to talk a bit more about FinReg and risk management around the financial system. Alex, on GFANZ.
Sure. And quickly, Claire, I think you hit the nail on the head there, that the key impact of the GFANZ announcement at the COP was building this political shift around looking at the accountability and integrity of commitments, and the questioning behind what is 130 trillion? How do you even measure that? How do you have confidence that what they've said is going to be delivered? I think that was the key shift that we got out of that announcement at the COP, rather than it being a confidence builder for countries to understand that there will be finance available for them to build their higher ambition NDCs. So I think the thing to watch next year will be how the UN Secretary General's expert group that will bring together recommendations on how to manage that accountability and credibility of commitments and pledges that are coming from the private sector. I think key to watch how that expert group process addresses not just the questions of how the pledges from the private sector are held to account, but also how they're held to account in transferring money into the economies where we need to see the investment in infrastructure and so on to enable higher ambition emissions reduction. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, thanks for that. So I'm just going to take a couple of the questions in the chat, and there's sort of themes emerging. Rachel, you asked about FinReg. Are we closer to having global standards? I will draw your attention to, I think, the announcement yesterday that we were excited by, I think, out of Basel. It could have been the day before, I've lost track. But we have teams that also tracked a lot the G20, which obviously fed into the COP. So we need to do a wash up of the G20 outcomes also, including the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which US and China, as we know, co-chaired. I think we had an analysis that we were quite pleased with what came out of that roadmap in terms of mutually intelligent frameworks to really try and shift finance, private finance, through the regulatory systems. So we can get back to you, Rachel, on more like technical detail of the roadmap from the G20, and also our analysis of what came out of Basel. We think that is a big area we're going to be pushing for next year, trying to globalize these standards. Because what we cannot afford is, 1,000 flowers bloom approach. Like, we don't have the time, as it naturally would occur, for these regulatory standards to harmonize. We've really got to take proactive and concerted measures to get, to globalize it and internationalize it. So we thought it'd be a bigger push to get Basel to pick this up. So the fact that they, said they were going to consult on these, I think that's a very fertile path. So we can get back to you more on that. On the MDB, Joan, your question, I haven't looked at the particular announcement on road transportation, although we are picking up an awful lot more energy around sustainable mobility and transport, as a big sector where we need to do a lot more. More broadly on the MDBs, again, we've got a team of colleagues who focus on the MDBs, have been building the building blocks for Paris alignment. And we've been talking to US Treasury and Janet Yellen's team about the work they've been doing as the largest shareholder with particularly the World Bank. And I think our general takeaway from that is, I think the MDBs had, it was a poor show basically in Glasgow. I think we had higher expectations, what they would show up with. We wanted a date certain by which all of them would be Paris aligned, and also like crystal clear language about getting out of fossil, all of it, oil, coal, gas, and putting a lot more energy and creativity and just basically tenacity into getting some energy transition deals done and figuring out how they were going to move the money. It feels a bit like they were sort of dragged reluctantly to show up and sort of repeated sort of some of the warm words. And again, we know that Janet Yellen did trying to convene the heads of the MDBs, not just once, but twice last year, and lay down her expectations in terms of Paris alignment by date certain, of a number for adaptation, and also some key metrics and tangible movements on private sector mobilization. So I don't think, from all accounts, they showed up giving her what she asked for. So I think the MDB is an area where we need to sort of rethink a strategy for how we get key donors and major shareholders to align and figure out what exactly they're going to drive through in terms of top-down reforms in 2022. And also we need to front load that next year, right? Because I think just leaving the MDBs to sort of figure out this bottom-up Paris alignment agenda, they've had a couple of years to do that, and I think my colleagues would say they didn't show up with what they needed to show up with. So it's interesting to see a lot of this analysis around whether Jay Powell is going to be given his second term in his job, less so about whether like Malpass should or could or would stay in his position as president of the World Bank, because there is an active debate whether you can get the reforms done from the World Bank with the leadership that we have. So I'll leave that aside, but if you want some more information on the transport piece, we can get back to you, Joan. We've covered your question on GFANS. I think there are some other questions again about the role of COP, the legitimacy of COP. There's a question from Joan about the fossil fuel industry and the contingency of delegates that they had. A question about like civil society space. And again, we were talking earlier about the role of COP to really transmit political signals into those spaces where civil society sort of have less freedom, and this is still very contested. And then the other, and so like there was a question about the role of civil society and media in driving this enhancement of NDCs before Egypt. And then another question about the midterms. So I think, Rachel, yeah, we'll connect you with our colleagues. So I think I'm going to ask Alex, if you'll say something about the role of media and civil society in driving NDCs, particularly in space, and the role of COP, particularly with countries that have this contested civil society space. And then Alden, you too, if you could say something about the role of COP, and especially as COP just being one venue. We've already talked about the G20, but as you alluded to, there are multiple venues now and processes where we've got to take this agenda. And again, the US is chairing some of those. And also, Alden, if you would speak on the midterms, the runway that we have ahead of the midterms. And then Taylor, I'd love to bring you back in, talking more broadly about FinReg and just risk management in general, which again was a big topic. So Alex first on COP27, role of media and civil society, and also the legitimacy of this COP given the fossil fuel industry and the delegations.
Sure. So starting with the first half of that question, I think the international diplomatic processes are particularly crucial for getting attention and the spotlight on some of these countries that don't have the kind of civil society, civic space and infrastructure to drive up that pressure for change on the domestic level, So I think the diplomatic process is not just the COP, not just COP27 as a moment, but also the other processes that we got hooks for out of this Glasgow moment, including around the work program that will be set up through the UNFCCC. That was one of the other acceleration outcomes from this package that will start at the mid-session meetings in May, June next year. There will be processes behind some of these sectoral deals that were created, and these create the opportunities for international civil society and media to shine the spotlight on some of those countries that are more difficult to reach through domestic campaigning pressure. In terms of the legitimacy of this COP, I don't think it's been called into question. I think it was a really difficult year for managing the attendance and inclusion and accessibility of the COP. And I don't think it was done perfectly. And I think that was clear from a lot of the pushback from civil society on the ground. And some of the questions weren't answered as well as they could have been by the UNFCCC or the UK presidency. But overall, the legitimacy of the COP as a space was maintained. What the challenges from this year teach us about next year is the need to really focus on what the inclusion and accessibility of the COP space for civil society looks like and how to preserve and maintain it, particularly going into a country where, as the questioner pointed out, some of the civic space is more strained. Alden.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, this is going to be interesting with the next two COPs being in Egypt and the UAE, which no one would call paragons of human rights and civil society engagement by the least. So how they are going to handle their presidencies will be key in terms of, do they allow the kind of participation, interaction, civil society actions, demonstrations, et cetera, that are a routine part of these COPs. In terms of your question, Mark, about the ability to leverage some of the countries you listed, I agree it's hard for civil society inside those countries to affect them, but I think civil society worldwide can shine a spotlight on them, put pressure on other countries to hold them to account. You know, and the business community, the investment community, others can have an impact on some of these countries, obviously. But this is a real challenge, you can't lay this at the feet of the UNFCCC or the COP and say it's their fault. I've often said that the COP is a mirror that we hold up to ourselves once a year to say how well are we doing collectively, and to say who's doing enough, who isn't, et cetera. And when you get an ugly picture back in the mirror, you can't blame the mirror. That's because of what has or hasn't happened in the run-up to the COPs in key capitals like Beijing or Delhi or Pretoria or Washington or Brussels, et cetera. It's really an expression of collective political will, and that's what we've really got to change. The good news is, in some of those countries, there's growing public awareness and concern about the impacts of climate change. I think that's why you're seeing a shift in Russia, for example, towards committing to net zero and being a little more reasonable this time than it has been at many other COPs, because Siberia was literally on fire this summer. 104 degrees Fahrenheit, huge melting of the permafrost. The notion that climate change is somehow going to be good for Russia is evaporating faster than the permafrost. And I think that's giving pause to Putin and some of his oligarchs. I don't know about Saudi Arabia. The US spent a lot of time engaging them. Saudi Arabia did make a net zero commitment regarding its own petrochemical operations, obviously not in the products it sells. But it's limited what we can expect. In terms of the US midterms, I mean, I can't tell you how many COPs I've gone to which have been at the same time as US elections. We had the COP in The Hague, which broke down because no one knew whether Gore or Bush was the election winner. And you had a huge food fight between the US and Europe over credits for land use sequestration. Only COP in history which has been suspended and gone to what's called a BIS session 6 months later. You obviously had the COP in Marrakesh in 2016 when Donald Trump was unexpectedly elected, and some of us had to figure out what that meant, and that's where we launched We Are Still In, among governors, mayors, business leaders, and others, to counteract what we knew was going to be a rough 4 years. The midterm elections will be just before Sharm el-Sheikh opens, and so the impact of that, if the Republicans take the House and/or Senate, will be significant for the administration in terms of what Alex referred to in their credibility in delivering their existing NDC, much less putting a bigger one on the table. And of course, it will also be significant in their ability to ramp up to the $11.5 billion that Biden committed in terms of US climate finance by the end of his first term, because Congress holds the purse when it comes to finance under our Constitution.
Thank you, Alden. Again, I think we all have I have post-traumatic stress from being in Marrakesh as part of the US government delegation at the time when we had that election result. So yes, it does have a big overshadowing effect on the COPs. This time it was a lot more positive experience. I think the role of the US, how the US showed up, put a lot of energy across the board, right, into sort of getting the outcome. And I think the work goes on. I will just say it is difficult to the question about how you get countries to table stronger NDCs. And ultimately, any country is only going to do that when they see it in their national interest. It can't be something imposed on them. And I think that's why, getting back to that FinReg question earlier, you're seeing, and the signals sent, you know, a lot of the political signals that were sent out of the G20, which again, the language we had in the G20 a year ago was just, you know, we never have hoped for that, right? So when we get a win, I think we very quickly move on. But the language on net zero, I think 90% of the global economy now is covered by a net zero pledge. Again, you can argue about the credibility of that again, but that's a political signal that I think sends a big sign about the future modern economy. And so when countries like Nigeria or Indonesia like pick up on those signals, and it's reinforced by the private finance and the sort of investment in emerging markets, I think then you start to see a recalculation of national interest. And of course, it can be made easier for them to transition and commit to do more. So it's looking at all of these reinforcing signals and feedback loops. But another big part of that, as Alden alluded to, and I'm going to ask Taylor to come in on, are the risks, right? The impacts that everyone is feeling, everyone is seeing, and that is shaping, I think, public's perception and desire for their governments, they're elected, you know, elected or otherwise, to do more, to provide a sense of order, protection, and direction. That is a big driver, I think, of countries stepping up to do more. Taylor, would you please elaborate on that and what we're seeing and hearing around the risk management frameworks around impacts?
Sure. I mean, yeah, maybe just starting with the financial regulation and ESG point and question from earlier. You know, I think just in the past few years, there's clearly been a much more serious effort, both from regulators and institutions and countries, not only just acknowledging that climate is a systemic financial risk, but then having recognized that, you know, what sorts of policies or frameworks do you need to put in place to actually manage those risks, both in terms of planning for the physical impacts and also the transition risk for moving to a different kind of economy. So you've seen more stress testing of financial plans, more use of scenario analysis, better data and metrics. And you've had more and interesting discussions between countries, I think, on sustainable finance taxonomies, you know, determining what is and isn't a green investment, as well as on risk disclosure. And I think that there's a sort of emerging conversation about how you more proactively invest in resilience. So, you know, Brian Deese out of the White House has been talking more about how you integrate resilience into macroeconomic policy planning, for example. So I think that the US, you know, being back at the table in terms of thinking about financial regulation and climate change has been really important there. So are we closer to having a sort of global approach to that? I think we are closer, although obviously there are always political challenges in getting that many countries to agree on one approach. But on risk more generally, I mean, I would say, you know, I think ambition historically has really been driven by both what countries think that they can do, but also largely by the sort of economic opportunity narrative, which is clearly really critical. I think increasingly ambition needs to be driven by a better understanding of climate risk and impacts and what that means. And I think the IPCC report from earlier this year is helpful in that regard. There's going to be another IPCC report focused more on impacts and adaptation coming next year, which I think will be helpful. And that sort of brings us back to the point around loss and damage. You know, loss and damage is clearly a moral issue. By any measure, the climate vulnerable countries have not caused the problem. But I think it's also a question of stability and peace and security. You know, if developed countries can't provide more support in dealing with some of these devastating impacts, which are already really stretching the capacity of many developing countries to deal with them, they're not going to have any fiscal space to do almost anything else, including investing in their own mitigation and adaptation. So it is very much, as you say, Claire, I think in the national interest of the developed countries to sort that issue out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, okay, so we're getting a lot broader already, not just the COP and climate diplomacy. I think touching on FinReg and debt and risk management, you can see sort of how this is a whole of government agenda and approach here. Any other questions? I know it's 11:47. Any questions? It's surprising no one's talked about China or coal or you know, many of the methane, many of the other areas that sort of popped up during those 2 weeks. I'll also draw attention to, I think in terms of national interest, again, this is out the G20, or I think it happened just at the very beginning of COP, the EU-US agreement on steel, right, and the tariffs, and particularly bringing in the green steel piece of that, I think, again, something we were pleasantly surprised by, and again, it's all part of the overall agenda and the signals that were sent. But please, if you want to speak up, right, you know, Brad, I don't know if you've got any other questions, you're already in the room. If others want to pop them up in the Q&A, we've got a few more minutes left. Alex wanted to come in on loss and damage, in particular around the US, and I'm sure Alden, you've got some final thoughts, and I'll just keep an eye if there's any other questions before we wrap up. Alex.
I think the final thing for me to add here is just the geopolitical benefit to highlight what Taylor was saying about the geopolitical benefit to the US on addressing these loss and damage issues, the importance of removing the shield that some of the target, particularly major emitting countries, can hide behind by having some of these solidarity questions on adaptation and loss and damage left unanswered. By closing that loop and addressing what does a financing option for loss and damage look like, the US can play a key role in driving that geopolitical pressure and conversation on for some of those particular target countries. So it will be a major priority for the US to focus on next year.
That is a key point, I think, the US. And John Kerry, of course, gave personal assurances, and Alden can say more about, you know, the assurances the US gave in private rooms and on the plenary that they would do more to come back with concrete proposals, not just on loss and damage, but the finance and its own plan. I think we're largely saying, I think Glasgow gave us a year to save the Paris Agreement, and later on, Alden and I are going to speak to the Europeans, the EU delegation and all their attaches, about, you know, they want to debrief about their role. But I think actually, no, I was going to say something about the China piece, but I'll leave that for another time. Alden, final thoughts from you about your main takeaways from the COP and the priorities now for the US. What are you hoping to see? And if you could sort of give us like when, like the year 2022, already there are some like markers where we're going to start seeing the progress.
Yep. Well, let me just build on what Taylor and Alex said on loss and damage, because I think this took the US a bit by surprise in Glasgow, how intense the focus was, how much pressure there was. They obviously didn't want to set up the financial facility that the developing countries were calling for, but they realized they couldn't block everything. And so they agreed to these dialogue sessions that Taylor mentioned, the first of which will be held in Bonn at the intersessional meeting in June. We did get assurances. One of the senior US negotiators told me that we need to find something in between open-ended, unlimited liability, which is the US goblin here, and fear, and paltry sums of money. And so Taylor and some colleagues at IIED have given them some initial thoughts on things they could bring to the table in June. And I got assurances from the head of the US delegation that they will bring constructive proposals to the table. So this won't be just a 2-year talk shop kicking the can down the road on loss and damage. And this has been a hot issue since the beginning of this process. I had to do shuttle diplomacy with some other NGOs in 2012 in Doha to prevent the US from bringing down the whole COP over what the small island states wanted on loss and damage language in the decision. So I think that's an opportunity. The others I mentioned, clean energy architecture, the Major Economies Forum, there will be a ministerial meeting on that held by the US in January. The US will be hosting the high-level Mission Innovation Summit and Clean Energy Ministers meeting. We had a dinner that I set up with Deputy Secretary of Energy Dave Turk and Assistant Secretary Andrew Light and some colleagues from DOE about how they can make best use of those processes. We're going to meet with them now that we're back in Washington and figure out how we can work together, because I think that's the bright spot here. If we can accelerate deployment of technologies, break down barriers, assure multilateral collaboration, that's a huge thing. Final point is on coal. A lot of people have said, wasn't it really disappointing and shattering that India and China watered down the coal language from phase out to phase down in the final moment? It was not a great moment for diplomacy. The process was irregular. They basically bullied President Sharma into accepting that language, otherwise threatening to bring down the entire process. But this is the first time in 30 years there's been explicit reference to coal or any kind of fossil fuel in the COP decisions. So this was significant. And obviously you have to phase down before you can phase out. So now China and India are committed to phasing down coal consumption. That was not how they went into the meeting, and they blocked language like that at the G20 Leaders Summit in Rome just 2 days before the COP. So I would say the coal language is actually a huge victory. And I give a lot of credit to some of my E3G colleagues working with the UK and others for keeping that in there. If you had asked me a week out from the end of Glasgow, would that language be in the final decision? I would have said no. I didn't think it was going to stay, but there was really some good diplomacy and some hanging tough by the UK and others that kept it in there, and that gives us something to build on over the next couple of years.
Okay, Alden, thank you very much, and to Alex and to Taylor. I think we'll wrap up here, but I mean, to Alden's point, again, you can look at, I thought you were going to use the pun that you prepared before, Alden, about Glasgow being glass half full or half empty. I will just say,
Glasgow half empty or half full, yeah. Glasgow.
I think it's the nature. It's definitely the nature of the beast. I think when you work on climate change, it's never enough. Obviously, it's never enough. You get what you can and push for more. Take a breather, and then we get back at it, ready for next year. But I just thank you for joining, and I just want you to know, E3G, we're here in Washington. We've got a ton of colleagues working on these particular issues. I was just going to say on the China, and I mean, at the end, India and China, it was not a good look, I don't think, for either of those countries to be seen right at the end, trying to get that word change, phase out to phase down. And also like the G77 as a big coalition, it's interesting to see how that plays out, right? These are all dynamic, not static sort of coalitions. And we're working in the US, particularly on a China strategy. And you can see there's lots of synergies between a US-China strategy and the US climate strategy, in that, you know, B3W as an alternative to the BRI with standards, also big energy deals with the likes of Indonesia and Vietnam. There are a lot of synergies here that we're trying to draw out and make the case. So I think it's a very interesting, there'll be interesting developments going through, you know, big push for COP27 and the more broader geopolitical force field, as well as sort of the economic restructuring. But we're here, we've got lots of experts if you need more analysis going forward. But for now, I'll draw your attention tomorrow to a panel we're doing. It's a public panel with the CEOs of the other green groups here, NRDC, WRI and CAP. That's at, I think, 10 a.m. tomorrow. If you want other perspectives and assessments, please, you're welcome to join that panel. And then other than that, I'll just call it a wrap here. Thank you for your time. And we look forward to continuing the conversation going forward. Thanks very much. And thank you to my colleagues. Bye.
Bye.